Let's get introduced to AWS Code Pipeline. In the general sense, when we say the word code pipeline, we're talking about the process of planning out some feature, coding it, compiling it, testing it, and then deploying it to some environment. Within AWS, there's a product called Code Repository, and this is a Git-compatible code repository. And if you want to implement a two-stage pipeline, what that means is you would check some code into a code repository, and then there would be another service. There's a service called AWS Code Deploy that would then take that code and push it into an environment, and you select which parts of your environment you want to push that out to. And Code Pipeline, AWS Code Pipeline, is the name of the product that listens for any changes in any given stage, and when it's necessary, it will move code from one stage to another. So in a more advanced pipeline, you could check some code in and have Code Pipeline listening for it, and kind of like this forklift, checked in code could be pushed into a build environment that does a compilation process, and Code Pipeline could listen for when that's done and send it to a testing suite, and if it passes all of its tests, it could then be listening for that completion and then move it on to AWS Code Deploy, which would push it out into an environment where you've specified where that thing should be deployed. And there are several options. All right, so let's go ahead and look at the actual AWS Code Pipeline product itself. If you log into your AWS console and you search for Code Pipeline, you will come into this interface here. And you could think about this sequentially, and the idea that if you started with some code that you checked into a Git-compatible repository, or even just push it to an S3 bucket, there's all kinds of different sources that are possible. That would be your first thing. You check some code in. Potentially, you might have some code libraries from third parties that you want to always include with your deployments of your software. Again, after the compilation or after the code has been checked in, you might want to do a build step, so compile it. There's a service that could do that in order. Then you push it out to where it goes. And then strangely, even though this is the umbrella for the whole thing, it's listed way down here in this navigation area, when really this is the part that oversees everything. So watch what happens if we click over here to create a new pipeline. So we click Create Pipeline, and it drops us into, first off, giving it a name. And so let's just call this production website. So we're going to facilitate the fact that anytime you check something into a code repository, it could be pushed out to, in this case, what will be our set of production websites. Right here, it's saying that it's going to create a new role, and a role is a permission in AWS. And the issue with Code Pipeline as it relates to permissions is that this service needs to act like you and do things related to reading from a code repository, interacting with your deploy service. Now normally only a permissioned person could do that, but AWS knows all of the common things that are typically going to need to be done as part of the code deployment process, and so it will create a rich policy document for you, give it a new name right here, and then it'll be associated with this pipeline that I'm naming right here. All right, so here's a key part. It says, where should the code come for this particular pipeline? Now, to build a pipeline from scratch with all of the relevant parts, including the source repository, building a running application, and then configuring the deployment environment, it takes a lot of steps. And so I'm not going to do all those as part of this video, but I already have some resources out there. And because of that, I have some items in the drop-down menus here that you're not going to see your first time through. But if you go through an actual tutorial, you'll build out the code repositories or the deployment area, etc. So first thing, where do you want your code to come from? Where should Code Pipeline be watching for any changes that trigger the execution of the code pipeline? So I do this little drop-down, and AWS Code Commit is one option. There are many options for where I could get code and watch for code changes. I'm going to select Code Commit. So in my Git repository. Well, I have several within this service, and if I just click here, here's one of them that I have, and I'm going to use the main branch. So I'm going to go ahead and click next. So now in theory, once I set this up, anytime I check something in, the code pipeline will be listening for it, and then it'll execute the whole thing. Okay, build process. I'm not going to do that, but I could if I wanted to. Here are some services that I could interact with with CodePipeline to execute a build process on the code that's been checked in. Yes, I will skip. All right, so here's the deploy service. It sounds relatively easy, but there's a lot of configuration that can go into this, particularly the code deploy service. So I'm going to select that, and I've already set some stuff up. I'm just going to select some things. Last thing I'm going to mention here is about the deployment group. So if you recall, over here, there are potentially a group of services out there, in this case EC2 instances, and so your deployment group could define like which instances are supposed to be updated with your application. So you can specify what it should touch and what it should not touch as part of deployment. And with that being done, we go ahead and click next. And if I had everything configured correctly and I clicked create pipeline, it would go ahead and just do everything it's supposed to do. It would check the code repository and it would try to push it out to some specific EC2 instances in this particular example. Once you have executed a code pipeline, you will see this graphical representation of what happens. So this is the first stage in my code pipeline, which would be noticing a change in the code repository. So what I did here was I did a commit operation in my Git repository, and I left a message saying that I added a sandwich image to a particular web page that I was working on. And then this goes from another color initially while it's starting to progress until it turns green, and that means it succeeded. Everything turns green. Everything that's green here was previously a different color. And then once that completes, it goes on to the next stage, and this will be one color, and then it'll turn green when it has been successful.